All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the November uh, Power BI and Fabric user group for Queensland. Um, got not a lot of people have joined yet, so I'm hoping that'll ramp up as we get into the next few minutes. But for those who are joining us for the first time tonight, welcome to our user group. So this user group is run by myself and Gilbert Cueva-Villiers, and just, if you ever feel like you want to contribute to the user group by assisting in any way, please get hold of us via Meetup. Be much appreciated. All right, so for the first timers who have joined us, we normally start with a what's new, in which either Gilbert or myself talk about what's happened in the month since our last user group meeting within the world of Power BI and Fabric. And then we'll hand over to our main speaker for the evening. And so over to you, Gilbert.
Awesome.
By the way, Gilbert, we're seeing your presenter mode, not your slide deck. There we go. Yep. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Okay, I'll quickly go through this. So there are some desktop updates that I'll start with regards to Copilot and Power BI, where they now just getting this working, and obviously making sure that your admin has enabled it, Copilot with Power BI to be working. Then there's some visual calculations updates where now you can do it on the left with the combo bar chart. The visual calculations will now work. And on the bottom right now, this will also work with field parameters. If you have visual calculations, they will work with that. So just more improvements to the visual calculations. Then there's the Azure map updates where they're talking about the data bound reference layers. So this is where you can now use actual data bound reference layers, as you can see in the highlighted sections, where you can actually highlight that with more advances in the Azure maps, so you can clearly make more definitions in what you're showing. There are some marker updates that continue to be improved with regards on the left-hand side is where you can categorize the categories. You can then also apply changes to the series, as well as on the top right is the different shapes that you can customize. And then finally, on the anonymies, the colors, you can now also customize those. So just more customizations coming to markers and how you can use them on your visuals. There's also a new list slicer, which is in preview. So again, they're just trying to update the slicer, and this is the first iteration of the new list slicer, if that's something that might be of interest to you. Then the dynamic format strings for measures is now generally available. Previously, it was in preview, so now it's fully supported, and you can use the dynamic format strings. On the service updates, there's a new view or DAX. It's an info.view where you can see on the top left where you can view the columns, measures, relationships, and tables. So what that means now within your model, you can easily extract if it's columns, measures, relationships, or tables, using the DAX measure to almost document or show these values or extract the values from your semantic model. Then there's a new value filter behavior. So I would encourage you to look at this in the blog post and potentially read Jeffrey Wang's blog post explaining the update to the value filter. So by default, it uses automatic, which is the current way it uses, but with the value filter behavior, there can be some instances where the values didn't look correct. So that's where you now have the options for the independent, which enforces the filters on the tables to be kept separate, or the coalesced, where this forces the value filter behavior to be enabled for the semantic model, but will result in combining the filters on the SAML1 to table. So that one I would recommend, as I said, just reading through how this changes and potentially could help improve some of your measures where you're having challenges in the past. Then there are some Snowflake connector updates, just the driver updates and performance updates. So if you're using Snowflake, something to look at updating. Then announcing the retirement of the real-time streaming data in Power BI. So what this means is, obviously it's already past the 31st of October. you can no longer create real-time streaming within Power BI, not within Fabric. They're separate, so just think of this in the Power BI context. And from October 2027, so this is a good 3 years away, the existing real-time models will be no longer supported. So just something to be aware of if you're using that capability. Then, as every month, there's a whole lot of visual updates. I would recommend, if you want to see what these are, going through to the Power BI monthly blog post where you can see the visuals and potentially if those might help and assist you. Then there's an update to the Power BI Enhanced Report format, or the PBR format, where some features weren't enabled. So now the additional features are you can publish the PBR report from Power BI Desktop, downloading the PBIX using the PBR format from a workspace, and now you can also upload a PBIX using the PBR format to a workspace. Previously, those were some initial limitations on the preview. Now moving on to the Fabric side of things, in the Fabric data warehouse, you now can create case insensitive collation, meaning that the data and the columns and everything is case insensitive, so it doesn't matter if you use uppercase or lowercase, that will work. There's also concurrency and performance improvements. For public preview, they've added the varchar max and binary max data types, and there's also JSON support enhancements if you're using, for example, the toJSON syntax in SQL and Warehouse that now is supported and enhanced. Then there's the live edit of the Direct Lake models in Power BI Desktop. So what this means is previously you could only edit Direct Lake modes in the service. You now have the option, if you download the latest version of Desktop and enable the preview feature, I think, you can then edit it within Desktop. So if you're familiar using with Desktop, it just makes it easy. The good news is as you're editing it, it will still be saving it directly back to the semantic model in the service running in the cloud. For data engineering, the API for GraphQL support for service principals enabled. So there's, as we're going along, there are more items that are becoming service principal enabled and enabling you to do additional things such as API and that. So this is just another area where they've enabled the service principal support. There's also automatic code generation for the API when using the GraphQL. So again, just saying if you want to generate the code in terms of how to use this, it will generate that code for you, making it easier to use in certain scenarios. Then the Notebook Git integration and deployment pipeline is generally available. So the Notebook Git integration, integrating with Git and notebooks and deployment pipelines now are supported for Git integration. The notebook in an organizational app. So this is the organizational apps which were previously released. They had a bit of limitation. So now you can not only add and report, you now can add notebooks into that organizational app for users to view and interact with. Then in the notebook, there's a mode switcher. So there's 3 modes that you now get. So one is the develop mode, which is I think the default when you come in to make changes, run and comment. You can now share this notebook with the run only mode. So what that means is they can run it, you get the edit where they can make changes and comment, but not run. And then the view only is if you just want people to actually view the content in the notebook, they now can do this. Also, there's updates when you are using the display and you're getting a view table. You can now, you can now multi-select a few columns and actually see on the right-hand side what those is happening in the table. You can then also select a particular row and it'll give you some context related to the row in the display table. And finally, you can also then, if you click on an actual column, it will give you what the details is in that column. So that can become handy sometimes if there's JSON within a particular column. On the right-hand side, you can see that JSON and expand it to see what's within that actual JSON syntax. As well as there's, you can select multiple rows within a single column and you can see the distribution and some of the details on the right-hand side. So just more improvements to the data using in a notebook. There's also options now to filter, sort, and search in your Lakehouse view. So this is if you want to just, you've clicked on the table, you can see a whole lot of information, and you now want to either sort it or filter it or search for things. This is now available in the Lakehouse view, so just making it easier again to view some of the data. There's a real-time intelligence integration with GitHub. So what this means, you can make backup and versions of your work. You can revert backwards and forwards. You can collaborate with others and apply the capabilities, with version control, but it's now available for real-time intelligence within Fabric. There's also an option now to quickly visualize query results in a KQL dataset. So if you run a query, as you can see on the bottom, you now can see there's an option to view this visually. So it can just help with, sometimes this makes more sense and a lot easier to view in a visual format. You can also save a query to a dashboard or pin to the dashboard from a KQL dataset. So again, just making some improvements with that. There is an on-premise data gateway update for October 2024. The Fabric pipeline integration in on-premise data sources is now generally available. And one thing to note is if you have issues with SQL Server certificate isn't trusted, when you install the gateway, there is a process that you need to go through to just get that certificate to be trusted through the gateway. And that's it. So thanks again. I forgot to mention in the beginning, apologies for that, to our sponsors at Adecco for helping with the meetup costs and the user group. And that's it. So thank you.
Thanks, Gilbert. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to the main part of our user group tonight. Just with regards to questions, if you can ask your questions in the chat, and if Gilbert and I can answer them, we'll do so. Otherwise, we'll wait for an appropriate time to interrupt Rod to ask the question. So with that, I'd like to hand over to our main presenter for the evening, Rod College. Rod works for Microsoft and is based out of Brisbane, yeah. And Rod's going to be talking to us about Power BI and migrating from P SKUs to F SKUs tonight. Thanks, Rod.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Gilbert, for the overview. It's funny, I work for Microsoft and I wasn't aware of some of those things that you mentioned, Gilbert. So thanks for the update there. That's great. So look, the genesis for the presentation tonight is, and I'll kind of get to this in more detail in a bit, but from January next year onwards, you won't actually be able to renew the Power BI Premium P SKUs if you have them. So that started a lot of customer conversations for myself around, well, what does that mean? What are the cost differences of moving from P to F? Do I have to? Are there any benefits in doing so? All that stuff. So tonight will be a bit of commercial stuff. There'll be some technical demos in there as well, and a few other things mixed in. So that's kind of where the session started from. So let's see how we go. So hopefully we kind of touch all the points around this topic, which will affect anyone with a Power BI Premium capacity. Okay, so it's actually been a little while since I've done one of these user group meetings. I used to do quite a few of them back when I first started with Microsoft in 2015. So in preparation for this one, I was thinking back to some of the earlier ones that I did, and I might be showing my age here, but this was some of the stuff that I used to cover. So performance point services was tremendous fun once you actually got it working. DataZen, if anyone remembers that, was amazing. And Power Map. So I joked in my bio about breaking a video card on my laptop. That actually happened. Really cool visualizations, but it broke things, which was interesting. And of course, all of these things are precursors to what we have today with Power BI, which is, of course, the last mile, if you like, of a much longer data transformation journey from left to right, as we often talk about. If you think back a few years, the complete pipeline might have looked something like this if you were all in on Microsoft Azure. So we might have Data Factory landing some source data into a raw zone within the lake, and then we use a Spark engine like Databricks or Synapse Spark to transform through the medallion architecture before serving that to Power BI, perhaps through a Synapse dedicated pool, which some people call the platinum layer, and then you might have the streaming layer up the top there. So all of that works fine, but there's a few challenges with this setup. So there's different commercial models there. So Power BI is software as a service, whereas things like Synapse and Databricks is platform as a service. Some are serverless compute, some are provision compute, and they use different storage formats. So we might have, Delta Lake, Parquet Delta Lake open source down here, whereas Synapse Dedicated Pool was proprietary format. And then, of course, each of these services might have different user interfaces. So a bit of a mixed bag with that approach. So when we built Fabric, we wanted to address all of those things. And the three key principles of Fabric, I guess, are firstly, it's all software as a service like Power BI. So there's no clusters to spin up. You just pick a compute size and away you go. Secondly, that compute is shared across all of those services, including Power BI. So you don't independently buy and size compute for each of these experiences. It's all shared. And thirdly, we unified the storage layer around open source Parquet Delta. So what this means is that we can now mix and match Databricks compute with Fabric's compute over the storage layer because they both read and write in the same format, which is Parquet Delta. So in this example, we might be using Data Factory for low-code ingestion into OneLake. Then we process that using Databricks for data engineering, and then have Power BI at the other end for reporting and dashboards with the storage layer in OneLake. So there's no copying of data here. Data Factory, Databricks, and Power BI can all use the same data storage format. And we also recently announced support for the Iceberg format as well, which is an alternate open source storage format used by Snowflake. And this is made possible by our support for the Apache Xtable project. So what this means now is that you can mix and match compute over OneLake with one copy of that data. So you might have Snowflake writing in Iceberg format, and then Databricks or Fabric reading that same data in Delta format, which is very cool and really helps achieve kind of the holy grail of what we've been talking about for years and years now, which is, avoiding silos of data or copying data around and having one copy of that data. So this is what we previously had. So you might, buy a Power BI Premium P1 capacity. And this is what we're moving towards today and next year onwards. So you buy a Fabric capacity, so for example, an F64, and then you use that for any of those experience, including Power BI. So in terms of the agenda tonight, we're going to zero in on why we're doing this, how you go about doing that, as in from an existing Power BI Premium to a Fabric SKU, and what the benefits are, including the benefits for just Power BI users. So if you've got no intention of using any of that other Fabric stuff, why are we making you do this, and what are some of the benefits of that just for Power BI users? And we'll also cover this, and I kind of mentioned this in the intro teaser for the session. Are Power BI reports and dashboards still relevant? It's a bit of a controversial statement, but this is coming up in a lot of my customer conversations now. If Power BI has been around for a long time now, about 10 years, and a lot of companies have hundreds, if not thousands, of Power BI reports. So they're saying, I don't want to have to go to Power BI report every morning and look for something of interest. I want to avoid all of that. Just tell me what I need to know. So we'll talk about some of the things that we can do with Fabric to help in that regard. So that's a bit of a long intro to introduce myself. So thanks for having me tonight. My name's Rod College. As Craig mentioned, I'm based here in Brisbane, and I started back at Microsoft in 2015, the year that Power BI was first released as a product. And of course, prior to that, as we know, it was a bunch of plugins to Excel that eventually came together into a single product. And these days, I spend most of my time covering Fabric, OpenAI, Purview, and occasionally the odd SQL Server conversation, just like the old days. All right, so back in March, our Vice President released this blog post covering the licensing update for Power BI. And the core point was that we are discontinuing the Power BI Premium capacity license and moving over to Fabric licensing for both Power BI and Fabric users. In July, we actually stopped selling Power BI Premium capacity. And from January next year, which is not that far away, you can no longer renew Power BI Premium capacity at the anniversary date. So this is not a question of, do I have to do this? It's a question of when you have to do it. And I should add, nothing in Power BI changes other than licensing. So everything still works exactly the same as what you're currently doing. You do need to move workspaces between capacities, which I'll cover off in a demo. But you also have lots more options now with some of the Fabric stuff coming in, which I'll cover in the demos as well. Okay, so in terms of the conversion, most of you probably know this, but for those that don't, a Power BI P1 capacity is the equivalent of an F64, a P2 is an F128, and so on. But on the lower ends, we can now go all the way down to an F2, which is 32 times smaller than what we previously have with the P1, to reduce costs for things like dev test workloads, and we'll talk some more about that. In terms of moving from one to the other, you simply reassign workspaces from the P capacity to the new F capacity that you buy, and I'll show you how you do that in a sec. And you also have a 90-day grace period after the P SKU capacity subscription has ended to still access anything that you haven't moved over to the F SKU. You still need a Power BI Pro license to publish Power BI reports to a workspace, just like you still required in the P1 days. And in case I forget to mention this later, you need a minimum of the F64, which is the equivalent of the P1, if you want to use the Power BI and Fabric copilots. So for production workloads, we recommend at least an F64. So you get all of the feature benefits of copilots, and you don't need Pro licenses for report consumers. And for the F2 to 32 capacities, they're really designed for test dev workloads. And to be clear, you can buy multiple Fabric capacities, just like you could buy multiple Power BI Premium capacities, and assign workspaces to the appropriate one. So you might have dev test workspace on certain capacities and prod on others. And this helps for chargeback scenarios as well. So if you're doing data mesh and decentralized data governance, this is really important. So business units can buy their own Fabric capacities and have their workspaces placed on them, and then they pay for the capacities. One more quick thing on commercials before we get into some more technical stuff. Unlike Power BI capacities, you can provision Fabric capacities as either pay-as-you-go or as a reserved instance. Now, if we think back to Power BI Premium, it was a 12-month reservation only. So this gives you a lot of flexibility for handling temporary or those spiky workloads. The general recommendation we make is that you use reserved instances for the base load to get the price discounts, and then pay as you go for the temporary or spiky workloads. And one other thing, the pricing is region specific. So when you look in the calculator or the portal, you'll actually see different pricing for Fabric capacity depending on the region you choose, unlike the old Power BI Premium capacity, which was a fixed price globally. And as I mentioned there, to be clear, you can have more than one Fabric capacity to support things like chargeback in a decentralized data mesh. So if we imagine we have 3 departments, so sales, marketing, and finance, each of those departments might have their own Fabric workspaces, just like Power BI workspaces, and each of those are assigned to a particular capacity. So in this example here, we have sales, which lives on the dedicated capacity A, and then we have the marketing and finance workspaces, which is sharing Fabric capacity B. So this enables those chargeback scenarios typical of data mesh. But they all store their data though in OneLake, and subject to permissions. What that means is that we can create data products, we can endorse them, we can share them without having to physically copy data around. If you have a multinational deployment of Fabric, each workspace is assigned to a capacity, and the capacity is located in a specific region. So in this case here, we've got a Fabric capacity in Europe and another one in the US, and the different workspaces up here are assigned accordingly depending on where the users are. So this supports data residency requirements. So for example, if you have GDPR as a requirement, you can have a Fabric capacity over here with users assigned appropriately, and then you might have different capacities in different regions for other reasons, for performance and latency and so forth. So you have that flexibility of multiple workspaces assigned to potentially multiple capacities which are located in specific regions. All right, so from an overall architecture perspective, if you're all in on Azure, you might have had something like this that we covered earlier. So ingestion using Data Factory, Spark, PySpark transformation in the lake, and then serving to Power BI, perhaps via Synapse, dedicated or serverless. So if we move to the Fabric architecture, we still have to do each of those things. So the question is, what are the benefits of doing that? What are the commercial benefits of doing that? And then what are the technical benefits that we're introducing in the next gen services? So we've touched on this briefly, but the main one is the capacity that you provision can be used for any part of the pipeline. So you can use the capacity for ingestion workloads, transformation workloads, consumption workloads in Power BI. You can also have a single monitoring dashboard across that whole pipeline. So previously you might have had different products with different monitoring dashboards. It's now a single unified monitoring dashboard across all of that. Unlike Power BI capacity, you can scale the Fabric capacity up and down, and you can also pause the capacity. So this is great for those spiky workloads and getting the best commercial outcome. And then finally, we've introduced the concept of bursting and smoothing, which is essentially being able to size for the average instead of sizing for the peak, which gives you a lot more flexibility. So just to talk about that in a bit more detail. So if you consider how we used to size workloads in the past, so let's say, for example, we had an overnight batch process that processed data, and you needed it to complete before 8 a.m., for example, when users start arriving and firing up Power BI reports. So in that scenario, you'd need to provision enough compute power to ensure the overnight processes complete on time. So with Fabric, we've got this concept of bursting and smoothing. So if you are, let's say, for example, provision an F64 capacity, we'll actually let you go above that to complete the job faster. But the extra compute that you use, you won't be charged for it, will essentially smooth that out over the next 24 hours. So you no longer have to size for that peak. As I said, you can size for the average, which provides a lot of flexibility commercially. A couple of other things on that. The smoothing happens over a 24-hour period, and there's guardrails in place for that. So if we think about what this means, so if you have no smoothing at all, you might have a job that takes about 3 hours on a small F8 capacity. If we take away all of the guardrails and let it go wild, that same job might complete in 5 minutes, but use the equivalent of 294 capacity units, which is awesome, but everything will then be pretty much throttled for the next 24 hours. So what we do is we kind of put guardrails in place so that same job, instead of taking 3 hours, it takes about 30 minutes, but the throttling doesn't occur for another 4 hours, which is a good blend of those two. There's actually a link which I'll put in the chat window, which kind of talks about this in a little bit more detail to help you understand the mechanics of how that works in the background. For those that are familiar with Power BI Auto Scale, this is kind of similar, but it applies to any Fabric workload. So for example, you might have a PySpark data engineering pipeline that can take advantage of this. The other difference is that with Power BI Auto Scale, once you scaled, that stayed in effect for 24 hours and you paid for that whole 24-hour period, whether you needed that or not. So with Fabric, if you scale up or burst temporarily, there's no charge at all because the overuse will be smoothed out over the next day's lower use periods. So a much better commercial outcome in that sense. All right, a couple of other key commercial points. So if you have an Azure commitment or MAC, which you might have heard of, your Fabric capacity spend draws down on that MAC, unlike Power BI capacity spend, as Power BI previously wasn't considered as an Azure service, unlike Fabric. I previously mentioned the choice of the reservation model as well as the pay-as-you-go model to get the best price performance blend, unlike Power BI, which is reservation only. I also mentioned that you can scale all the way down to an F2 SKU, which is 32 times smaller than the previous minimum Power BI capacity of F1. So this is great for dev test workloads. And there's also some Azure-only features that you get access to on a Fabric capacity, such as trusted workspace access to storage accounts that are behind firewalls from Fabric shortcuts. So this is only available on F SKUs and not on the Power BI Premium P1 or above SKUs. Okay, so what about if you're a Power BI only user and you have no interest in any of that other stuff because you're using Databricks or Informatica or something else? So for those customers, there's still three key benefits here. So you can scale down to a much smaller size from a P1. So you can go down to an F2, which is 32 times smaller than a P1. So again, this is great for dev test workspaces. You also have the option of pay as you go now with F SKU. So previously you had to commit to a year with a P1 or above SKU. And we also have the option of direct lake mode in Power BI, which is a big feature if you haven't heard of it. And this could reduce the impact on source systems and also the price of sizing your source systems. I'm sure you've seen this before, but just to recap. So before Fabric, these were the two options for Power BI. So we had direct query mode, where the Power BI report every time would go back to the SQL source, for example. So this was great in the sense that the data was always up to date in the Power BI report, but there was a performance impact as it hit the source system every time. Import mode was great for performance because every day, week, hour, you'd take a copy of the data for the report and you'd cache it in Power BI memory. So great for performance, but potentially the data is out of date for a day or whatever the refresh period is. With Fabric, we introduced this third mode now called Direct Lake mode. And essentially, it's almost the best of both worlds. So I say almost, and I'll talk some more about that. You get the benefit of always reading the source directly every time. So it always goes back to OneLake to read the data. But because the format of the source data is in Parquet format, which is a columnar compressed format, and we also have some smart caching there, you also get the performance benefits as well as the data always being up to date. So this is kind of the best of both worlds and is probably, in my opinion, one of the key benefits that you get of moving to an F SKU from a P SKU. Before we jump into some demos, let's talk about direct lake mode with mirroring. So if we focus on the left-hand part of this diagram for a second, you'll see that we support mirroring of source systems, including SQL Database, Cosmos, and also Snowflake now, into OneLake. So what this actually does when you set this up, and this is a no-code experience, so we've kind of gone from pro code to low code and now to no code. What it'll do is it'll read the change data capture endpoint of the source system and then trickle feed that source into OneLake. And what we actually do under the covers is when we trickle it in, we save it as Parquet Delta format. So you can then just start reporting on that in Power BI using that direct lake mode that I just spoke about. So this results in a couple of key benefits. So we reduce the impact of the source system. We're no longer reading that from reports. It's trickling in. And also avoiding the need to develop ingestion pipelines for that because it is a no-code experience. The other thing to call out here, the final thing before I show some demos, is data quality. So anything that lands in that OneLake, in Fabric OneLake, we can now analyze for data quality using the new Purview data governance data quality feature. So as well as offloading the performance impact, we can also then use that trickle feed CDC in OneLake to actually do data quality checks on. And if you're using some of that data to ground AI models, it's a whole other conversation. Obviously, data quality is critical in that regard. Okay, that's a whole lot of talking before we get to demos. I'll just pause at that point to see if there are any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the only question we've got so far is, are you going to be willing to share your presentation at the end?
Yeah, I can do that. And I think you're also recording the session as well, right? So we can share the recording. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into demo mode. I wanted to start with provisioning Fabric capacity. So I mentioned that it is all software as a service. The only thing you have to do before you start using it is basically provision the Fabric capacity. So this is my Azure portal. I've gone in here, I've created a new Azure object of type Fabric capacity. You basically say what subscription and resource group you want it to go in, choose the name, what region you want it to live in, and then choose your size. So if I click on change size here, this is where you can choose your Fabric capacity. So we start with an F64, that's the default because that's the equivalent of the P1 in Power BI previously. And you can see here we can go all the way down to an F2 for $262 a month, all the way up to an F2048 for $270,000 a month. So everyone, please go off and spin up a few of those. That'd be great. Thanks very much. So that's the provisioning process. So basically, you provision that. And then the other thing I just wanted to show in here was once you have provisioned a capacity, if you go into that capacity, you can do things like pause the capacity, which I won't do now because I need it for the demo. But you can also come in here to change the size of that capacity and basically scale it up or down as required. As I mentioned before, this capacity I think is in US West 2. This is the US West 2 pricing that I have for pay-as-you-go. If you get reserved instance or you choose a different region, that pricing will obviously vary. Now, before we get into the demos, just one other thing to call out. If you have the rights, if you go to your Power BI page, you can go into the admin portal, which is what's here. If you go down to the workspaces, this is essentially where you can reassign workspaces from one capacity to the other. So if I choose my demo workspace, for example, I can click on that and say reassign, and then you can choose the different capacities to reassign from and to. So if you're currently on a Power BI Premium P1 capacity, for example, that will be up here somewhere, premium capacity. So you can then just go into each of the workspaces and choose fabric capacity once you've provisioned that. And if you have more than one, you can choose which capacity to assign that to. There's a bunch of service offerings we have to allow you to do this at scale. Because if you have hundreds or thousands of workspaces, there's a whole lot of clicking happening here. So we've got some scripts to kind of automate that process. So if that's of interest, reach out and we can make the connection there. One other thing to point out. Yep.
Sorry, we have a question. If you change capacity, how does the change in billing work? Is each day prorated? And I'm guessing, I'm thinking, and Conrad, come off mute if I've got this wrong, but I think what he's asking is if you in Azure you change the size up or down, how does?
Yeah, okay. So if you scale a Fabric workspace, let's say you go from an F2 to an F2048, and then 20 minutes later you scale that back down again, you're only charged for the period of time that it was scaled up. So this is quite different to Power BI Premium P1 capacity, for example, where it was essentially a 12-month commitment. So Fabric capacity is very scalable up and down, and you can also pause that. So if I've got the question right, yeah, it's prorated, not just based on each day, but I think it's down to the hour level. It might be second. I can check on that, but definitely a lot more granular than each day. When switching capacity up and down, how does costing work out? Yep, I think I've answered that one there. Depends if it's reserved or pay-as-you-go. Yeah, that's right. So if you do pay-as-you-go, you can scale up, you can scale down, you can pause, you can do all of that good stuff. If you reserve an instance, then it is a commitment for that period. That's why we talk about having a combination of both. So you look at what your base workload is and you provision reserved instances for that. And then the flex up from that, you can have more flexibility with the pay-as-you-go.
Thank you.
All right. Before I jump into the demos, I just wanted to also point out at the tenancy level, you can do this. So you can go in here to use Fabric items because, again, when I talk to customers, they kind of go, hang on a second, if we go across to an F SKU, does that mean people are going to start smashing our Power BI capacity with data pipelines and all that other stuff? So what you can do is come in here and you can basically turn that off, in which case no users can use any Fabric stuff at all. Or you can be more selective. So you can say, I only want to apply that to certain entry groups. And you can also do that at a capacity level as well. So let's say, for example, in that decentralized data mesh, you have certain business units that buy their own Fabric capacity and they want to do whatever they like on there because they're paying for it. Then you can choose this option here to say, well, yep, on all of these other capacities, no, you can't do any Fabric stuff, but on this one, you can. So you can turn that on at a capacity level. All right. So let's jump into some of the demos now. So This is my Fabric landing page. If I go to the home screen, you can see we've got this choice of experiences down here. So these are the different personas. Some of this UI will change moving forward, by the way. This is what it is at the moment. And then you can do things like, what do you want to do? Task-based actions. I can create a brand new lakehouse, which is kind of the starting point for getting data into Fabric OneLake and doing something with it. The other key thing to point out here is the OneLake Data Hub. So if I scroll down here, I can see these are all of the workspaces that I have access to. If I click on my demo workspace, I can see that I've got a bunch of different things on this workspace. There's Power BI reports, there's pipelines, there might be some notebooks. So essentially with Power BI today, you have a Power BI workspace and it just contains reports or dashboards or data sets. Now with the Fabric workspace, you have all of that, but then you also have all of these other things as well. So data marts and KQL databases, which is the real-time streaming and so forth. All right, so for the demo, what I did was I went to Kaggle and I downloaded this synthetic data set. It is about 20 gig, I think, uncompressed, about 6 gig compressed. Essentially, it's an FSI type data set, so it's essentially credit card spend across different transaction categories, so housing, rents, motor vehicle expenses, and so forth. So that was the data set that I used. So what I did was I created a Fabric lakehouse. So over here we saw that we can come in here and say create a new lakehouse. Then I came into my lakehouse, and the first thing I wanted to do was to get that file, which was this one here. Actually, no, sorry, I started with this one, the transactions.zip. It's about 5.3 gig. So how did I get that in there to start? So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can just click on Get Data and upload files. There's also a Windows Explorer extension where you can literally just drag and drop like you have for OneDrive, but you can just do this upload files. The other thing you can do is the classic data factory ingestion pipeline. So you might build a low-code data factory pipeline that looks something like this. Or the way that I did it, just for fun, was I wrote a Spark notebook. I actually used the Copilot to generate this code for me. I'm not that smart. So I said, hey, how do I convert a CSV file into a Fabric managed table? So it generated this code for me, which is awesome. So essentially what it does is it reads the CSV file. It then loads that to the Parquet format in a data frame. It writes the Parquet file, and then this bit of code here saves that as a table. So at the end of that process, you will see something like this. So starting from the other thing I did was I wrote a data factory pipeline to unzip the file. So from the zip format to the CSV, then I wrote the notebook to bring that in. But at the end of that process, you get fact transactions, then customers, and various other things. Okay, so once you've done that, one of the other key things to note here is that as soon as you land stuff in OneLake, you automatically have a semantic model provisioned for you, a default semantic model. Now you can create a new semantic model over that, or you can accept the default. In this case here, I created a custom semantic model by clicking new semantic model and choosing the tables. This is for a separate demo, but if we just focus on these three tables, so I selected just those tables to include in the semantic model. Now this is essentially the equivalent of a Power BI data set. However, it's automatically created for you. You no longer need to go to Power BI desktop, create the data set, publish it to Power BI service. As soon as stuff lands in Fabric OneLake, you have this semantic model. I can then click on Open Data Model, and you get the familiar experience here. And just one thing to point out, if I click on this table here and go over to Advanced, we spoke about direct lake there before, so import mode, direct query, and direct lake. So you can see that by default, the storage mode for that table is direct lake. One other thing to point out, if you go back here and choose the, if I go to my type here and choose the semantic model, if I choose my transaction semantic model and go to settings and go down to refresh, so by default, this is turned on. So you can read there what it does is Power BI will automatically detect changes to the Parquet Delta files. And as soon as changes are detected, it'll automatically reflect that in Power BI. So that's kind of the equivalent of direct query, where it's always reading the latest copy of the data, but because it is in Parquet format, you also get the performance of import mode. Now, you can turn this off. Why would you do that? if you're only running your PySpark notebooks overnight to process the data, and you know that the data won't change during the day, you can turn that off and you can effectively do what we used to have with refresh mode. But by default, that is turned on. All right, just going back to, where were we? To the transactions data model. So once you have that data model, up the top here, you can then click on that and you can do things like auto create a report, which will use the Copilot to look at the data model, kind of have a bit of a think and then create a starting template, or you can just create a blank report from scratch. So this is what I created up from that data model. So essentially this is the data set that I chose, those synthetic transactions from Kaggle. So you can see I've got filters up the top there for dates, for customers. I've got a couple of measures there, and then the graph. Now, this is direct lake mode. So whenever I play with the filters here, it's going to read the Parquet Delta files, and we can see here the performance of that. So as I'm slicing and dicing, you can see that that's updating in real time. Now, this is 262 million rows in the Parquet files, which is not massive, but it's a decent size, and you can see the performance impact of that, and then I can filter for individual customers. So I haven't had to do import mode. I'm not doing direct query. All I've done is land data in OneLake, convert it to Parquet Delta as a managed table, automatically created the semantic model for me. Then I created the report, and away we go. So there was no Power BI desktop involved here at all, and this is running on a F2 capacity. So the smallest capacity that we have, and as you saw there, the performance is pretty decent for that. Right, so I might pause there to see if there's any questions, and looks like there is a few. What are the implications for existing Power BI reports published to Power BI service if we decide to move to Fabric capacity from our existing P1 node? We assume all current users would now require a pro license to access reports. No, but what else should we be mindful of? Supported dataset size. We require at least an F2 capacity to support existing reports. Okay, so long as you have an F64 or above, you don't have to have a pro license for consumers of the reports. You only need a pro license for people publishing the reports. So that's the first thing to point out. In terms of the first part of the question, so you don't need to redevelop the Power BI reports. You basically just reassign the Power BI workspace from the Power BI capacity to the Fabric capacity, and then all of that will move across. Will we require at least an F2 capacity to support existing reports and their scheduled refresh cycles? Yeah, so F2 is the minimum. I'd recommend for production at least the F64, so you get the Power BI Copilots and the same performance as what you would have had on the P1. An F64 is exactly the same capacity as a P1. So if you were handling things okay with a P1, that will translate across to an F64. Now, if you then start using additional Fabric features or Copilot features, that will draw from that compute. So you may need to scale that up though. Does this have any impact to users in a pro workspace? Yeah, so unless it's backed by Fabric capacity, you won't be able to have access to things like Direct Lake or Power BI Copilots and so forth. If you have a premium per user license, the only thing you can do is Power BI stuff. You can't do Fabric stuff. So you'd need a Fabric capacity for that. I think that is, yeah, that's all the questions there. All right.
Rod, sorry, there is one follow-up there right at the end. So B saying, I meant not moving to Fabric capacity at all. Will our existing reports still be able to be refreshed? Can users with a pro license still access the reports?
So you can continue using the existing Power BI Premium capacity until your anniversary date. So let's say, for example, your anniversary date is September 2025. You don't have to do anything until September 2025. But if your renewal date is, let's say, 1st of February next year, then by the 1st of February, you have to convert from a P SKU to an F SKU. But until that time, everything continues to work as it is without any changes. Does that answer the question?
I don't know. B, you're welcome to come off mute if you want to clarify.
Yeah, so I'll make some assumptions that, yeah, okay. So your existing reports will still be able to be refreshed? Yes, nothing will change there. Can users with a pro license still access the reports? Yes. Yeah, so nothing changes there in terms of licensing until you cut across to the Fabric capacity. Now, you can actually do that before the renewal date to take advantage of things like this, the direct lake mode. So you can move before that date, and if you want to do that, please reach out. But you don't have to. But after January next year, when the renewal date comes up, or the anniversary date, that's when you have to move across. All right. So in the intro to this, I spoke about some customers are saying, "Hey, I've got all these Power BI reports, and there's thousands of them, and I don't use half of them. And can you just tell me what I need to know?" So for that, we can do things like this. So I can click on the little bell icon there and click Set Alert, and essentially I can do things like, when pick your measure and pick the operator becomes more or less than a value. Becomes greater than the value, and then notify me via email or Teams or a custom endpoint. So that's kind of the first basic thing. You've kind of been able to do this for a while now. What this does introduce, though, is the concept of, well, how do we do this not just for batch reports? Because even though this is useful, you still have to, have the batch data coming in, processed overnight. So you may not know about this change until 24 hours or a week or maybe a month later. So the question then is, well, how do we do this in pretty much near real time or as close to real time as possible? So that's when we start pivoting from traditional Power BI reporting to more of the streaming stuff. So that's where we get into a part of Fabric called the real-time hub. Now, real time, as the name suggests, is no longer about data factory pipelines running once a day and selecting from a SQL database and medallion architecture and all that jazz, as cool as that is. That's where we get into things like this, where we can say, let's add a source, and the source is an event hub or an IoT hub. So if you're in an industry where you have heavy machinery, so for example, mining, so where you have streaming data from sensors, even retail with temperature sensors or cameras, this is the scenario for you. So you can ingest data into Fabric using some of these, but you can also see other things. So you can have streaming data from change data capture endpoints. So you can be reading in near real time from a CDC endpoint. We also support native Kafka. We support Confluent, Kinesis data streams. So this is not just Microsoft stuff here, it's CDC endpoints from potentially anywhere, on-prem or AWS, GCP, but also PaaS services on other clouds as well. So if I go back to slides for a minute, we can talk about what that looks like in a bit more detail. Give me one sec. All right, so once you've set up the ingestion, that goes into what's called a Fabric event stream. And then you can do things like this. So this is a low-code tool. Now, before I talk about this too much, you've been able to do this for a while now using Spark streaming, but that's, like heavy pro-code PySpark stuff. So what we're introducing in Fabric is a low-code approach. So think of this as kind of like Data Factory, but for those streaming workloads. So once you create the entry point, which could be an event hub or an IoT hub, you can then just start building in these other actions. So by default, it creates an event stream, and then you can have various feeds off that. Let me get my laser pointer for a bit. So for example, I can have a feed off that for renaming columns in the stream. So this is not renaming columns in a database, this is renaming in-memory items within the stream. So I'm renaming ceiling to absolute temperature and so forth. And then I might be syncing that to the lakehouse, which is in Parquet Delta format. Then I can have other things. So like we can do in Data Factory, we can filter this. So this is a retail store scenario. So the sensors are the battery level of the sensor and the temperature reading in Fahrenheit. So what I can do here is say, well, for that stream, just give me the filter for the Miami store. And then I can be pushing that out to a separate event stream. I can also be pushing it to a Custo database. So down here, we spoke about Lakehouse in Parquet Delta format. This is a special optimized format for time series data. And basically, we store the data in a different format for essentially streaming real-time dashboards. This is still fast, but this is super fast for those near real-time scenarios for time series datasets. And then you can do other things like do aggregates in the stream and then push that out to separate Custo databases. The bit I wanted to focus on here was this reflex action. So in the previous slide, we spoke about Power BI reports setting an alert on a measure. This is where you can basically set alerts on a value in the stream. So let's say, for example, we have a delivery company and we're delivering ice cream, and it's a really bad scenario if the temperature falls below freezing. So all of the ice cream will melt. So we can set an alert in the stream to notify me as soon as that happens. So this is effectively what we can do. So we might have the event stream with all of the properties and fields, and then we can set all of these individual alerts. So in this case here, this is the data streaming in. In this case here, it's from delivery trucks, and the alert that we've set up is when the temperature goes above a certain threshold. So basically, we can choose the attribute, we can choose the upper bound, and then we can choose what to do when that occurs. Now, the cool thing here is that that can be an email message, can be a Teams message, but we can also call a custom REST API endpoint, which then might invoke some special downstream business process, or it can be a Power Automate flow. So you can fully customize what happens when this occurs. So this is going well beyond classic Power BI reporting. This is now in the realms of listen to something in the stream. When it happens, do this. The other thing I spoke about there before was syncing the data not to OneLake and Parquet Delta, but to a Custo database or a KQL database or an event house, as we call it. What you can then do is do these highly optimized time series type reporting. Now, this is a slide, so this is not the screen that I meant to screenshot. But the idea here is that you can, this was done on an F2 capacity when I was playing around for a few days, so it ran out of capacity. But over here on the Copilot, you can basically just type in what you want to do. So if you don't know Custo, it's kind of like T-SQL, but it's a little bit different. So this is like select star from thermostat, join to other tables, group by. But you can see here, I created this code from this command here in Copilot. So create a query to compare the performance, battery level and temperature of devices across different stores, generated the code goes in, you can execute that. If that's what you want, you can then pin that to a real-time dashboard. And then you get kind of like a Power BI report, but this is a real-time dashboard. And then up the top there, you can see where you can do the refresh rates of either constant refreshes, or you can choose how frequently that is refreshing. So this is the real-time dashboard, but then you also have that reflex action, which is where you take actions in the stream. So data coming in could be from a CDC endpoint, it could be from a IoT sensor via IoT Hub, Kafka, Kinesis, various other things come into the stream. Then you can set up the reflex actions. If this happens, do this straight away. You can sync it to the event house, and then you can run Custo queries, KQL queries on that, and then pin those to real-time dashboards as well. So this is well beyond what we've been able to do with traditional Power BI dashboards. So when you say, yeah, why should I bother going to Fabric? This is the scenario, or one of the scenarios, that you can then invoke on that Fabric capacity, in addition to all of the other stuff that you've been able to do for Power BI for a while. Now, just to talk about this in a bit more detail, this is where you have to know what you're looking for. So if the temperature sensor goes above a certain level, then notify me. But what about scenarios where you're talking about the Donald Rumsfeld unknown scenario? So you don't know what it is that you're looking for. You just effectively want Fabric to tell you when something doesn't look right. So we have a private preview for this. So effectively what we can do is in the stream, we can detect anomalies without you having to define any of this. That's in private preview at the moment. So if there is interest in that, let me know, and we can connect you with the anomaly detection in stream capacity. All right. The one thing I haven't spoken about a lot so far is the Copilot features within Power BI. So as you've probably seen, we've had Power BI Copilot for a little while now, so you can do things like, help with DAX code, which is great, but also creating reports from scratch. This was a LLM project that I did for an airline to analyze or summarize complaints information, so you can have Copilot for that. What I might do, excuse me, is just play this video, which kind of talks about the Copilot capabilities in a bit more detail. So hopefully the sound comes through here. Let me get my laser pointer up for a minute. I'm just going to play this video now.
Next generation AI in Microsoft Fabric empowers you to unlock the full potential of your data. With Copilot integrated into every data experience, Microsoft Fabric lets you use natural language to bring your data to life. From integrating data to writing code to finding insights and creating reports, new transformative AI experiences work alongside you every step of the way, so you can stay focused on getting value from your data. Copilot helps turn your words into data flows and data pipelines, so you can intelligently integrate data from anywhere. When writing code, Copilot automatically suggests code and entire functions in real time. And Copilot can guide you to create machine learning models to unlock insights in your data. Just by chatting with Copilot, you can visually explore your data to create stunning reports, discover insights, and summarize your data into easy-to-understand text narratives for sharing. With Copilot, you can turn insight into action with triggers that monitor your data and notify users. You can even create your own custom natural language experiences that combine Azure OpenAI models and your organization's data, and easily publish your creations as plugins. And with your data in Fabric, Copilot provides insights and answers everywhere work gets done. Most importantly, Microsoft Cloud runs on trust.
Okay, so that is the Copilot, not just for Power BI, but also all of the Fabric experiences that you see.
Next generation.
All right, so to close, I just wanted to touch on this, what I spoke about before. So, going beyond the basic Power BI stuff and, what can you do within Fabric. So we spoke about this scenario, which is the real-time streaming. I also wanted to cover the Q&A, which was kind of mentioned briefly at the end of that other video. I'll play parts of this video, not the whole thing because it's a bit long, but essentially this is where if you have a Fabric OneLake with tables in there, rather than create Power BI reports over it, users can just ask questions of the data directly in natural language. So I'll play part of this to illustrate that.
So I'm going to give you a sneak peek of one of the ways you're going to be able to bring custom generative AI to your data in Fabric. Let's create a new Fabric item. I'm going to name it Loyalty Member Support Insights because what I want to create is a custom generative AI tool where I can ask questions about loyalty members and customer support cases for those members. So the first thing I'm going to do is add my data from OneLake. I can just select a lakehouse, and now I can select the specific tables I want the generative AI to have access to. And that's it. That's all the setup I need to do. And now I can start asking questions. Let's ask how many support calls we've had from loyalty members, but break it down from the source the loyalty member joined from. Now, behind the scenes, we use our AI models to generate a SQL query and give an answer. Now, this is a little different than Copilot and Power BI, because the goal here is to let you put generative AI directly on your data and then integrate it into your own custom solution. For example, giving your own custom AI solutions the ability to interact with your enterprise data. And the skill is really just focused on what it knows, which in this case is Contoso Outdoors loyalty members, data, and support cases. Let's ask another question. Who is the most recent loyalty member to make a support call? And the answer is Angelina Schlitz.
All right, I'll pause there. You notice over on the right-hand side here, the notes for model. So if you're familiar with prompt engineering in generative AI, this is essentially where you can add in prompt engineering to help the Copilot answer the questions in the way that you choose. I'll fast forward to the video to the point where we've mucked around with this for a bit and we're ready to deploy this. And then up the top here, we can see the publish button. So I'll just play this part of the video.
Wow. And right now in the sneak peek, it gives me an endpoint I can use to send questions to. But this is really an ideal fit for integrating this capability into other RAG-based AI orchestration.
So what this is doing then is saying, okay, we've got our lakehouse, we've got the tables, we created this AI skill, we're now publishing that out to an endpoint so that you can effectively have a bot or part of an application where users can just be asking questions in natural language. Via Gen AI, it's going to come back to your Fabric lakehouse and answer the questions based on the data and purely grounded on the data and nothing else. So that's that feature that I wanted to cover. And in this case here, this was an example that I just built. In the interest of time, I'll just show the screenshots. So that data set that I had before, the synthetic spend from Kaggle, I built this AI skill. I chose all of these tables, and then I just asked this question: what was the total spend for clothing in April 2016? It answered that question with that measure, and you can see I've got a bit of prompt engineering here in the notes for the model. To confirm that that was correct, I went back to the Power BI report, just chose the clothing for April 2016 using the dates, and you can see there that that number was correct, 11.383 million. And then I can then publish that using the publish skill up the top there to that endpoint. All right, I'm going to finish off with something a little bit different. So for those following along at home, you might have heard recently of this feature. This is from Google, called Notebook LM. It's pretty wild, and I'm going to show what I built for it. So basically what I did, I took a PDF screenshot of what I built, which is over here on the left-hand side. I threw it into Google's Notebook LM, and then I turned on this podcast functionality. Now, I'm not going to play the whole lot, but essentially what this does is create two people generated using AI to talk about what this data is. So I'll just play a bit of that.
Okay, so get ready, everybody, because today we are going deep on spending habits.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah. So we've got some pretty interesting data here.
Okay.
We've got excerpts from this document that's mysteriously called, or maybe it's a sign of the times, you know, economic uncertainty and all. People are cooking at home more.
Yeah, you're probably right. It's definitely cheaper to eat in than go out these days.
Okay, so you get the idea, right? So we've had customers approaching us saying, hey, that's pretty cool. How do we do that on Azure? So I'll drop the link to the chat window in here. So we effectively have that functionality that you just saw over built all using Azure services. The cool thing is that, and this is a publicly referenceable site, so Vista Group in New Zealand have built this out. And so essentially what they're doing is their execs, when they're driving to work in the morning, are listening to a podcast of their sales data using this technology. The data's in Fabric, Gen AI over the top. So as they're driving to work, they have this podcast playing, talking about their sales numbers. And so to the point about at the start of the presentation where I spoke about, hey, you know, like we've got all these Power BI reports, no one uses them anymore. How do we do this better? So we spoke about streaming data in real time. We spoke about the Gen AI with deploying Q&A bots. This is kind of next level again. So some pretty interesting stuff. And as I said, I'll put the links to the GitHub repo to build that out. All right, that's it. We covered a whole lot there. The intent here was really to make you aware of all of the new stuff that you can do once you convert from a Power BI capacity to a Fabric capacity, and there's a lot there. If you then extend that into services like OpenAI, you can really transform what used to be fairly boring reports into something, you know, truly next level. And things like Data Activator and that podcast, I think, are great examples of that. All right, that's it for me. I'll pause there. Hopefully that was valuable, and throw it open to any questions, comments, anything else. Craig, over to you.
Yeah. Are there any final questions? Please feel free to come off mute to ask them if you want. Otherwise, we'll wrap up for the evening. Okay. Well, Rod, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. There was a lot of great information in there. It's going to be interesting to see when the forced conversion from P SKU to F SKU starts happening. It'll be interesting to hear some of the war stories, of which I'm sure you'll hear a lot. So please do share when they come along.
Yeah, so we're obviously here to support and also have great partners in Craig and Gilbert for that process as well. So yeah, so and there is that grace period as well. So yeah, be aware of it. It's coming. Make sure you plan for it. There is the grace period afterwards. So it's not panic stations, but yeah, just something to be aware of. And as you saw, there's plenty of good reasons to convert. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. our session next month will actually be on the 12th of December, the usual date, which is the first Thursday. Both Gilbert and I are going to be at a conference happening in Sydney, so we won't be able to run it then, so we'll run it the following Thursday. It's going to be a bit of an Ask Me Anything style session, which we've done many times in December's before. We've really got some interesting people lined up. One that I know is confirmed is Mim, who's very well known in the Power BI and Fabric sort of industry, so to speak. I'm sure a lot of you recall Mim because he's a Brisbane boy as well. So, looking forward to that, and we'll see you on the 12th of December for our final one for the year.
Thanks all.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Yeah.